April 7, 1945. The East China Sea is quiet, too quiet. Then, low on the horizon, something glints like shards of glass. A lookout aboard the Japanese battleship Yamato shouts a warning. Moments later, the bridge phones erupt. The world's largest warship, 72,000 tons of steel and pride, begins to turn. Sirens wail. Anti-aircraft gunners rush to their stations. They have no air cover, no retreat, no chance. Overhead, more than 300 American carrier aircraft are closing fast. Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers, sweeping in like hawks on a wounded beast. The crew of the Yamato doesn't know it yet, but the clock has already started ticking. From the moment those planes appear on the horizon, the ship's fate is sealed. 4 minutes. That's all she has before the first American torpedoes strike below the waterline, before the sea itself begins to swallow Japan's last hope. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this isn't just another battle. This is a death sentence disguised as honor. The mission is called Operation Tengo, a one-way voyage to Okinawa, a last stand meant to shock the Americans and inspire a dying empire. But out there, beyond the waves, the US Navy has already solved a deadly puzzle: how to sink a fortress built to be unsinkable. They've learned where to strike and when. And in those next 4 minutes, as hundreds of bombs and torpedoes carve the ocean, history's most feared battleship will learn that even mountains can drown. The story of the Yamato isn't just about firepower. It's about pride, timing, and the terrible silence between detection and destruction. April 7, 1945. The East China Sea is quiet, too quiet. Then, low on the horizon, something glints like shards of glass. A lookout aboard the Japanese battleship Yamato shouts a warning. Moments later, the bridge phones erupt. The world's largest warship, 72,000 tons of steel and pride, begins to turn. Sirens wail. Anti-aircraft gunners rush to their stations. They have no air cover, no retreat, no chance. Overhead, more than 300 American carrier aircraft are closing fast. Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers, sweeping in like hawks on a wounded beast. The crew of the Yamato doesn't know it yet, but the clock has already started ticking. From the moment those planes appear on the horizon, the ship's fate is sealed. 4 minutes. That's all she has before the first American torpedoes strike below the waterline, before the sea itself begins to swallow Japan's last hope. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this isn't just another battle. This is a death sentence disguised as honor. The mission is called Operation Tengo, a one-way voyage to Okinawa, a last stand meant to shock the Americans and inspire a dying empire. But out there, beyond the waves, the US Navy has already solved a deadly puzzle: how to sink a fortress built to be unsinkable. They've learned where to strike and when. And in those next 4 minutes, as hundreds of bombs and torpedoes carve the ocean, history's most feared battleship will learn that even mountains can drown. Beat, reflective pause. The story of the Yamato isn't just about firepower. It's about pride, timing, and the terrible silence between detection and destruction. By late 1944, the US Navy faced a terrifying question: how do you sink a ship that was never meant to die? American bombers had pounded Japanese warships again and again, but vessels like the Yamato and her sister ship Musashi seemed to defy destruction. Their decks shrugged off armor-piercing bombs. Their gun turrets were sealed fortresses. Conventional attacks were like throwing pebbles at a cliff. Something had to change, and the answer came not from admirals, but from engineers. Inside the Bureau of Ordnance, men in oil-stained shirts huddled over blueprints and chalkboards. They studied every inch of Japanese armor reports, every survivor testimony, every torpedo failure log. The conclusion was both simple and revolutionary. You don't attack a battleship where it's strongest, you strike where it floats. The Americans realized that Yamato's greatest strength, her massive weight, was also her Achilles heel. She needed perfect buoyancy to stay level. If torpedoes hit deep enough below the armor belt, they wouldn't just punch holes, they'd twist the ship's balance, force her to list, and flood the very systems keeping her alive. But hitting that target was easier said than done. Early in the war, American torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. They ran too shallow, exploded prematurely, or didn't detonate at all. Pilots joked grimly that they were delivering mail, not torpedoes. By mid-1944, that changed. Engineers perfected the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, redesigning its fins and depth regulators so it could survive high-speed drops and strike deep, sometimes more than 20 feet below the surface. To deliver it, they used the Grumman TBF Avenger, a lumbering, heavily armed torpedo bomber that could take massive punishment and still bring its payload home. These planes weren't glamorous like the P-51 Seconds or Hellcats, but in the Pacific, they became silent killers. Pilots learned that attacking from one direction wasn't enough. A single hit on a battleship could be contained, but if you struck repeatedly and only on one side, you could break the ship's balance and ensure she rolled over. It was a tactic born from brutal logic and real data. Every sinking, every post-battle report added another piece to the puzzle. By the time the Americans faced Yamato, they knew the key wasn't firepower, it was coordination. Hundreds of planes attacking in waves, dive bombers forcing the ship to turn, fighters strafing the decks to suppress anti-aircraft fire, and the Avengers slow, steady, fearless, delivering the killing blows from sea level. They had turned science into strategy, and soon they'd test it against the largest warship ever built. The torpedo puzzle was solved. All that remained was to put it to use against a target big enough to shake the world. April 7, 1945, began like any other day at sea-grey horizon, low swell, men moving with the practiced calm of sailors who have seen too much. But this day carried a different kind of weight. The Yamato steamed south on a course toward Okinawa, a hulking arc of honor and desperation. Her mission had a name: Operation 10 Go. It read like a funeral march, one-way escort, minimal fuel, few escorts, and no meaningful air cover. The plan was simple and brutal: reach Okinawa, beach the Yamato, and fight ashore long enough to force the Americans to pause. It was theater, sacrifice, and spectacle rolled into one. Tokyo had pinned too much on symbolism. The Admiralty sent the fleet partly as a signal to the Japanese people, a demonstration of resolve when resolve was running thin. But at sea, symbolism does not stop shells or close the sky. The Yamato left port with her engines heavy and her decks full of men who believed in duty, not survival. She carried fuel for a one-way run and core hopes for a nation that could not afford them. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, their route had been read like an open letter. American codebreakers, months of intercepted traffic, and a patient intelligence machine had revealed 10 Go's timing and course. The U.S. Navy did not stumble into the Yamato by chance. They had laid an ambush on paper long before pilots reached the sea. Task Force 58, assembled not by accident but by cold calculation, carriers launched, decks full, radios buzzing with orders that would turn daylight into a killing field. When radar first painted a blip on an American screen, the crews on the carriers saw more than metal. They saw the moment their planning would be tested. Pilots were armed, briefed, and hungry to finish what years of war had started. Hundreds of planes filled the air, each with a role and a target. Hellcats would wrest control of the sky and hunt any Japanese fighters. Helldivers would hammer from above and force the Yamato to turn. Avengers had one task: glide in low, ride the flak, and place torpedoes where they would do the most damage. The approach was clinical. Scouts tracked the fleet. Signals confirmed position. And then a voice over a carrier net. Target sighted. Proceed to intercept. That one radio call was the fulcrum. From the moment the word left the speaker, everything moved with a harsh, efficient rhythm. Planes formed, throttles opened, and pilots checked instruments as if checking a life preserver that would not come. For the men aboard the Yamato, the first visual sighting of American planes was the alarm lookouts, and gunners saw shapes, then color, then the unmistakable silhouette of an American aircraft. For the Americans, it was the instant their calculations would either succeed or be tested by luck and courage. The clock began the moment those first shapes were identified and confirmed. From sighting to the first underwater hit, the opera of destruction would compress into minutes, not hours. The Japanese had no time to improvise grand repairs or summon reinforcements. Their training could not stretch into the split-second decisions that followed. In the space of roughly 4 minutes, orders would be shouted, valves slammed, and bow and stern would answer physics, not commands. In those minutes, the Yamato's fate did not hinge on bravery or honor. It hinged on timing, coordination, and a plan the Americans had polished until it ran like a machine. The trap was set not by a single bomber or a lucky hit, but by intelligence, engineering, and the orchestration of hundreds of men in cockpits who trusted their instruments and each other. The Yamato sailed into a net she could not see, and the hunters above had only to spring it at the right moment. The moment of contact came at 12:32 p.m. A lookout's voice cracked across the Yamato's bridge. Enemy aircraft sighted, bearing 310. From that instant, the countdown began. Sirens wailed through the decks. Men ran toward gun mounts, hatches slammed, and the mighty ship began to twist its rudder hard to port. The air vibrated with tension. Above the low drone of the engines came a new sound, a deep, rising hum that grew into a thunder. Hundreds of American aircraft, dark specks at first, now filled the sky. The formation of Avengers and Helldivers broke apart like a flock of hawks converging on a single prey. The first bombs hit water ahead of Yamato's bow, throwing up columns of spray that rained back onto her decks. Tracers streaked the air, glowing orange threads, trying desperately to cut through the swarm. The Americans had learned their lesson. Instead of random strikes, they moved like clockwork. Hellcats swooped down to strafe the decks, silencing the 25mm guns that spat fire in panic. Helldivers came screaming down from altitude, forcing the giant ship to veer away from bomb paths. Each maneuver turned her massive hull and exposed her side. That's when the Avengers came in. They flew barely above the waves, engines snarling, torpedoes slung beneath their bellies. Each crew had just one shot. Set depth 20 feet, one pilot radioed. We're going under the belt. At 12:36 p.m., the first torpedo struck. The impact sent a shudder through the entire hull, a violent, low-frequency tremor that made metal groan like thunder in a cave. The ship listed slightly to port. Another hit followed seconds later. Then another. Each explosion forced water deep into the lower decks, flooding compartments faster than the pumps could manage. Within 4 minutes, Yamato's myth of invincibility was gone. Smoke poured from her sides, men were thrown from gun stations, power flickered as breakers tripped and generators shorted. Officers shouted orders lost in the roar. The portside gunners, waist-deep in water, kept firing into the smoke, not knowing the sea was already claiming their deck. The precision was terrifying. American pilots concentrated their torpedoes on one side, knowing that flooding could not be balanced. The Yamato's pumps fought to compensate, but physics had no mercy. Each hit deepened her list, every turn worsened her exposure. 4 minutes, that was all it took for the mightiest battleship on Earth to begin dying. From the first sighting to the first fatal hit, the battle had shifted from man to machine, from courage to mathematics. Those 4 minutes sealed her fate. The rest would be a slow, burning descent into chaos. The ocean had turned into a stage, and every move now followed choreography, written by experience and precision. To the men aboard the Yamato, it felt like madness, the air roaring with engines, the sea exploding around them. But from above, the Americans saw order, not chaos. They called it the Torpedo Ballet. Each Avenger moved according to plan. They approached from different bearings, each timing its run so that torpedoes would strike in quick succession one after another, never giving the damage control teams time to react. From 5,000 feet up, a Hellcat pilot watching the attack later said, "It was like watching arrows hit a bullseye over and over." The Avengers flew low, skimming the wavetops, salt spray hammering their canopies. They were slow and heavy, but steady, the perfect killers of giants. Their torpedoes, Mark 13 seconds, had been tuned and tested for months to survive high-speed drops. Now, in this single engagement, all those engineering hours found purpose. They ran deep, silent and merciless, punching through the sea before slamming beneath the Yamato's armor belt. Hit after hit tore open her side. Compartments flooded, power lines snapped, and the massive ship began to roll. The port list grew worse, 5 degrees, 10, then 15. Gunners fought to stay upright as water poured through the scuppers. The great ship's own armor, meant to protect her, now worked against her. The water that forced its way in couldn't escape. Every sealed compartment became a trap. "Starboard engines ahead full," the bridge ordered. They tried to counter-flood, to balance the list, but it was too late. The torpedoes had done their work not by tearing her apart, but by throwing her equilibrium into chaos. From the sky, pilots reported over the radio, "She's rolling over. Repeat, Yamato, rolling. Keep hitting her port side only." American coordination was near flawless. Dive bombers circled, dropping ordnance to distract. Fighters strafed lifeboats and gun stations to keep the crew disoriented. Then another torpedo slammed home, deeper this time, punching through to a boiler room. The explosion ripped through pipes and machinery, sending boiling steam and scalding water through the lower decks. Inside the Yamato, it was a vision of hell. The corridors filled with smoke and heat, hatches warped, trapping men alive. Yet still, they fought, dragging hoses, slamming doors, trying to isolate compartments. The list increased to 20 degrees. The starboard guns couldn't even depress enough to fire. Every turn of the rudder made it worse. The Americans could see her agony. From above, the battleship looked like a wounded whale, surrounded by sharks. Each torpedo wake converged, exploding against her hull in perfect timing. The air shimmered with rising heat and smoke, and through it all, Yamato refused to die quietly. Her main guns, impossibly, still fired great blooms of flame leaping from the barrels, the recoil shaking water from the decks. She was blind, half-flooded, but defiant. For the Japanese crew, every pull of the trigger was an act of defiance, a message to the heavens that the spirit of Yamato would not bow even as she bled steel into the sea. But the ocean was patient. The hits had done their job. Flooding crept upward deck by deck. Pumps failed. Power flickered. The torpedo ballet had ended, and the silence that followed was worse than the explosions. Below the decks of the Yamato, the world had collapsed into darkness. Emergency lights flickered red and then died, leaving corridors lit only by the faint glow of fire and molten metal. The smell was unbearable. Oil, blood, smoke, and seawater mixing into a thick, choking vapor that burned the lungs. In the engine rooms, men worked waist-deep in boiling water, trying to keep the turbines alive. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes like serpents. Every few seconds came another deep metallic groan as the hull twisted under pressure. The sound wasn't just noise, it was the ship's death cry, echoing through the steel like a heartbeat slowing down. Crewmen moved by touch, voices were hoarse from shouting through smoke. Damage control officers ordered compartments sealed, knowing it meant trapping their own men behind bulkheads. "Shut it!" Someone screamed and a heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the cries on the other side. There was no time for grief, only reaction. Farther aft, the torpedo hits had ripped open the port side, and seawater rushed in with unstoppable force. Within minutes, the lower magazines were flooded, ammunition soaked, machinery dead. Men clung to ladders as the deck tilted sharply. A few tried to climb up toward the main deck, but the gangways were slick with oil. One slip, and they vanished into the black water below. Still, discipline held astonishingly. Officers barked orders, young sailors obeyed. The Japanese Navy's code of honor ran deep, drilled into them from the first day of this service. Many believed their deaths here would carry spiritual meaning, that dying aboard Yamato, Japan's greatest warship, was an honor beyond measure. But as the ship began to list past 25 degrees, faith met reality. Machinery broke loose from its mounts. Massive shells rolled from their storage racks, crushing anyone in their path. One compartment erupted when fuel lines ignited, sending a sheet of flame roaring through a passageway. The men who survived that moment said it sounded like the air itself was screaming. Up on the bridge, chaos turned to grim resolve. The commanding officer, Admiral Seiichi Ito, stood motionless for long moments, staring at the horizon through a haze of smoke. He had refused to abandon ship, even as signals from surviving destroyers begged him to escape. His aide handed him binoculars. He lowered them slowly, whispered a prayer, and simply said, "This is where we end." The crew still tried to save her. Pumps roared, hoses hissed, orders flew. But it was a losing battle. The power to the forward guns failed. Communication lines were dead. Radios crackled uselessly. The sea had breached too many compartments, the list now near 30 degrees. Some men leapt overboard, only to be sucked into the vortex forming along the hull. Others stayed, gripping the railings, singing the Imperial anthem through the smoke. Then came the final blow. At 2:03 p.m., a torpedo struck near the port engine room. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Flames raced downward into the magazines, thousands of tons of ammunition waiting below deck. Seconds later, the world split open. A massive explosion erupted from the center of the ship, a blinding flash seen for miles. The Yamato disintegrated in an instant, the blast so powerful it vaporized steel and hurled debris thousands of feet into the air. Survivors described the sound as if the earth itself had cracked. What had been Japan's greatest battleship was now a mountain, a fire collapsing into the sea. The smoke rose 6,000 feet into the sky, a black monument to pride, sacrifice, and the unstoppable evolution of warfare. Out of a crew of more than 3,000, barely 300 would survive. The rest vanished beneath the waves, carried down by the very ship they'd sworn to protect. When the smoke finally cleared and the ocean stilled, the age of the battleship was over. The Yamato's death wasn't just the loss of a ship, it was the death of an entire philosophy of war. For decades, navies around the world had believed that size and armor defined power. The bigger the guns, the thicker the armor, the greater the dominance. The Yamato was the ultimate expression of that belief, 72,000 tons of invincibility, designed to crush anything that floated. But her sinking proved that brute strength meant nothing against speed, precision, and the sky itself. American admirals didn't just win a battle, they rewrote the rules of naval warfare. In less than 10 years, air power had replaced armor. The carrier, once seen as a fragile experiment, now dictated the fate of empires. The Avengers and Hellcats that tore the Yamato apart cost a fraction of her price, required fewer men, and could strike from hundreds of miles away. It was efficiency versus grandeur, and efficiency won. For Japan, the loss was personal. The Yamato wasn't simply a warship, she was a floating temple of national pride. Every rivet had been crafted in secrecy, every gun cast as a symbol of divine destiny. Her very name came from the ancient word for Japan itself. To lose the Yamato was to watch the empire's soul sink beneath the waves. In the months after her destruction, survivors spoke of guilt more than defeat. Many believed they had failed their ancestors, failed their emperor. But even among the bitterness, some saw clarity. They realized that courage and sacrifice, no matter how pure, could not fight physics and innovation. Technology had changed too fast, and pride had blinded command. American analysts studied the wreck and confirmed what their torpedo pilots already knew. The Yamato's armor had done its job against bombs, but not against water. The torpedo hits, concentrated along one side, had overwhelmed her ability to balance. The flooding had been perfectly orchestrated, a mathematical certainty disguised as chaos. It was no coincidence. It was design. And yet, among the victors, there was no celebration, only awe. One American pilot later wrote in his logbook, "We watched her go down and felt small. We had destroyed something magnificent." Even those who fought her understood that they had witnessed the end of an era, an age when wars were fought with giants of steel and courage, face to face, across the horizon. The lessons of the Yamato echoed far beyond that day. Naval architects stopped thinking in inches of armor and began thinking in miles of range. Battleships faded from the seas, carriers and submarines took their place. And yet, the ghost of Yamato remained not as a weapon, but as a warning. She was proof that pride can outbuild reason, that belief can blind design, and that even the strongest walls crumble when the world changes faster than the people who build them. The Japanese called her the spirit of the nation. The Americans called her the last of the monsters. History remembers her as both a masterpiece and a mistake, magnificent and doomed. In the end, it all came down to 4 minutes. 4 minutes that separated the proud defiance of a crew from the silence of the sea. 4 minutes that marked the death of the world's most powerful battleship and the birth of a new kind of warfare. When the Yamato rolled and vanished beneath the waves, the ocean didn't just swallow steel. It swallowed an entire way of thinking. For centuries, navies had measured strength by weight and caliber by who could throw the biggest shell the farthest distance. But in those 4 minutes, a new truth emerged. Control of the sea would belong not to the giants of iron, but to the wings of men. The Avenger pilots who returned to their carriers that evening were silent. Some smiled faintly, others just stared at the sea. They'd done their job, they'd ended a threat, closed a chapter, made history. But even among victory, there was an odd melancholy. One pilot, barely 22, wrote later, "We trained to kill ships." But when Yamato went under, it felt like watching the sun set on the whole war. For Japan, that sunset was literal. The loss of the Yamato was more than tactical, it was spiritual. It was the end of the empire's illusion that honor alone could hold back the tide. In her final moments, as explosions tore her apart, she became what her name had always meant, the embodiment of Japan itself, powerful, proud, and doomed by the very weight of that pride. Even today, divers who visit her resting place describe a strange calm there, an enormous shadow lying peacefully beneath the waves, her gun still pointed toward a sky that betrayed her. No longer a weapon, no longer a threat, just a memory, the ghost of a time when steel and faith tried to defy the future. Those 4 minutes remain a legend, not because of how she died, but because of what they revealed. That innovation beats armor. That information beats secrecy, and that courage, no matter how pure, can't outrun change. From that day forward, the battleship was no longer the ruler of the sea the carrier was. The Yamato's fall became the line that divided the old world from the new. And so, when historians speak of the dawn of modern naval warfare, they always return to that single moment in 1945 when a mountain of steel met a storm of wings, and in 4 relentless minutes, the future claimed the sea.